again, welcome to this workshop on mitigation strategies and carbon pricing in the Asia Pacific. We come to you today virtually, which is by necessity, but we're all suffering around the world from the effects of COVID, both the pain, the suffering, and the economic chaos, no less than in the energy sector. Here, the IEA has been monitoring events for the last months, and it's clear energy demand has declined by about 5% this compared to last year. Um, CO2 emissions have declined, but it's not anyone's desired strategy for reducing emissions through crisis and health and economic cost. And investment as well in the energy sector has also fallen by about 18% so far this year. Again, which is not putting us on track for decarbonizing our energy sectors and investing in clean tech. So with the state of COVID and the state of uncertainty that we have, the IEA came forward early on in the piece with a sustainable recovery plan to try to remind governments that around the world as they develop their stimulus and economic recovery packages, that we should be taking advantage of this to not only bring economic revival, but to bring a clean tech revival that can contribute to the energy transition. And with this plan, which we outlined in July, there's scope for combining both the boost to the world economy, but also creating 9 million jobs and putting emissions into structural decline, and not the simple temporary dip that we've seen so far this year. And around the world, this roadmap can be implemented, and the IEA is always ready to help do that. We're starting to see some of these efforts come through in different countries' recovery plans, and of course, we're seeing several announcements of net zero emissions targets, including China, Japan, Korea, in addition to the EU, UK, South Korea, and Canada. So these are all good steps, but they are just announcements. Welcome though they are, we also need to see the measures behind these announcements, the policies and measures and actions that will actually be the drivers to bring these emissions reductions about. So we need to see these concrete policies. We also need to monitor and track what's going on to be sure that that these policies are effective and bringing emissions down. And certainly, always from the IEA's perspective, we also need to ensure that these emissions reductions are not in any way jeopardizing energy security. So that's another aspect that is close to the IEA's heart, which we always closely monitor. So on all of these fronts, the IEA is producing data, indicators, and analysis to ensure that we're taking the best possible routes to decarbonizing our economies and boosting economic growth. Part of this, of course, can be driven horizontally with horizontal pricing instruments such as carbon pricing and ETS regimes. These are in place around the world. There are around 46 different countries, national jurisdictions, which have carbon pricing in some shape or form as a means of harvesting market signals and getting market players to respond to corrected pricing signals. And it won't be the only instrument. There are always a suite of instruments and policies needed to bring emissions down, but these are a core cost-effective route being developed around the world. The IEA is working closely around the world as well with countries to implement such schemes. We have good working relationships at the moment with China and Thailand in the Asia Pacific in particular to help design and implement carbon pricing instruments. They're useful for a number of reasons. Partly in the short term, they can provide the price signal which can generate fuel switching. The UK in particular is a shining example where the combination of a carbon floor price together with the EU ETS regime has contributed to the very significant switch from coal to gas, where we've moved from an electricity supply in the UK where coal provided 39% of electricity in 2012 to 5% in 2018, and I think they proudly boast near zero these days. So there's a short-term price incentive, and then in the longer term, the price signal can also help shape and steer investment decisions. and which in itself can help stimulate the investment in the clean tech energy technologies we need to actually deliver long-term and major emissions reductions. So it's a useful, growing, uh, cost-effective instrument that can be used around the world, and we're very happy to be fostering discussions that can bring this forward. So once again, on the IEA's behalf, welcome. And now I pass on to my co-chair, Will Ackworth, to bring further introductions. Thank you.
Many thanks, Tom. So my name is William Ackworth, and I'm the head of the ICAP Secretariat. And on behalf of the International Carbon Action Partnership, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to today's workshop. So following on Tom's remarks a little, 2020 has been a year that will not be soon forgotten. While the world was gripped by a global pandemic, bushfires raged, temperatures soared, and hurricanes and cyclones had devastating impacts on coastal communities, all indicative of the fact that we are actually now 1.1 degrees warmer than pre-industrial levels. Yet with close to 40% of global emissions now falling under net zero commitments, we may still look back on 2020 as the year that we finally changed course and made serious progress in addressing global climate change. And I think Asia will be remembered as a pivotal point in the climate mitigation journey, with that short period of time in which China, Japan, and South Korea joined New Zealand in setting net zero targets by the middle of the century. And so while consensus seems to be emerging around the need to reduce emissions to net zero, how exactly we were going to rewrite the global economy to shift away from a 200-year reliance on fossil fuels demands urgent attention. And here at ICAP, we share the belief with the IEA and with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung that carbon pricing is an effective component of the mitigation solution. By pricing greenhouse gas emissions, we can send appropriate signals to producers and consumers, as well as investors, that high carbon goods and assets will only have a limited shelf life in the global economy. However, to be effective, we know that carbon prices must be designed to take full account of the local economic and political and social context. Again, through leadership of the national and subnational governments, Asia provides a diverse set of experience with carbon pricing design and implementation. So with only 3 decades remaining to reach net zero emissions, it is more crucial than ever that we take stock of recent policy developments to distill and effectively communicate the key lessons learned. Only through this powerful form of collaboration do we believe that we can succeed in our efforts to address global climate change. So it is in this context that ICAP is co-organizing this event with our close allies at the International Energy Agency and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung's Regional Program for Energy Security and Climate Change as an opportunity to come together to understand what role carbon pricing is playing in the region and how we can learn and effectively scale up this policy instrument. So acknowledging that it's been a very busy year for virtual events and even a busy week for carbon pricing discussions in Asia, with complementary discussions organized by the World Bank and IETA earlier this week, it is really fantastic to see so much interest in the discussions today. And myself personally, I'm really looking forward to a fantastic set of speakers and panel discussions. So welcome everybody. And I would now like to pass on to my colleague, Christian.
Well, thank you, Tom. Thank you, William, for a kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Christian Hübner, and on behalf of the Regional Program Energy Security and Climate Change of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, I wish you all a warm welcome to this important event that we have organized jointly with the International Carbon Action Partnership and the International Energy Agency. Well, it is actually the 3rd time we do this together, but it's the first time we do it public. And maybe there's no better moment to do this kind of dialogue in a public environment. We are facing currently the 5th year of the Paris Agreement and a challenging pandemic year 2020. And especially due to the pandemic and all its economic impacts, I wouldn't have believed that climate policy will remain and keep this type of priority. Because it is still a huge challenge for everybody to work on this. Or even becoming more important. But it happens. The EU made out of a Green Deal, a Green Recovery agenda. China, Japan, and South Korea announced carbon neutrality target, and possible new upcoming US administration will rejoin the Paris Agreement. And keep a bit more focus to Asia Pacific. I see still a lot of work on carbon pricing mechanism. This will still implement it in the next years. And that is actually one topic we're going to talk about today. Ladies and gentlemen, the agenda today contains a lot of very interesting topics. We are going to start with a keynote on accelerating climate ambition in the light of COP26. Then we will have a first session on carbon pricing and NDC updates in Asia Pacific, and a second session on the role of carbon pricing in countries' long-term mitigation strategy. And we are going to come to an end with some closing remarks. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm really looking forward to listen to our speaker, who would like to thank for sharing their time and knowledge with us today. And ladies and gentlemen, once again, I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this high-level dialogue on mitigation strategies and carbon pricing in the Asia Pacific. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank the International Energy Agency and the International Carbon Action Partnership for this excellent cooperation. With this, I give the floor back to Tom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a brief IT note. Throughout the course of this workshop, you are welcome to pose questions via the Zoom questions and answer option. Those will be passed through to the moderators of every session, and we can take questions. But then, now, without further ado, we jump into our keynote session, and I'm delighted to welcome Ambassador Ken O'Flaherty. The ambassador is the regional ambassador for the Asia Pacific region. He has a long experience with the British Foreign Service around the world, and that's covered a range of subjects, but in particular, energy and climate change policy. So this is a busy year for you, Ambassador, and welcome, and we look forward to hearing your words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom, for the introduction, and thank you, of course, to the IEA, to ICAP, and to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for putting on this really important and I think quite timely dialogue. I hope everyone has been keeping safe and healthy in these difficult times, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. The premise of today's dialogue is that carbon pricing can play a critical role in the transition to a low carbon economy. And so I'd like to start with an example from the UK that shows that this is very much the case. In 2013, coal accounted for over 40% of electricity supplied in the UK. Just 6 years later, in 2019, that had collapsed to a mere 2%. And earlier this year, Great Britain went a full 2 months with no coal-powered electricity in our system, the longest period in our history since the 1880s. A few years ago, I think this would have been largely unthinkable. Now, large amounts of coal-free electricity, large periods of coal-free electricity have become very commonplace in the UK. One of the changes since 2013 has been a price on carbon, as Tom has just mentioned. In 2013, the UK introduced a carbon price floor, which sat alongside the EU emissions trading system and placed an extra tax on fossil fuel-powered electricity. This tax has quite simply made it more expensive much of the time to run coal than gas, and it's also dramatically improved the economics for renewable energy. It's helped to drive a huge reduction in UK emissions in our electricity sector, and it's among the reasons that we, the UK government, are convinced of the vital role that carbon pricing can play in getting us globally to net zero emissions. We have ahead of us a crucial year for global ambition on climate change, which will culminate, of course, in COP26 next November. For us as presidency, the challenge is clear. Without further action, we will not keep global warming to 1.5 or even 2 degrees Celsius, and the consequences for populations worldwide of such a failure will be dire. That's why we, as the UK government, are working hard to engage governments, businesses and civil society worldwide to deliver strong climate action. In 10 days' time, our Prime Minister, together with the UN and France, and in partnership with Chile and Italy, will convene leaders from around the world in a virtual summit. Those who are willing to make concrete commitments to ambitious action under the Paris Agreement, whether that's new, more ambitious NDCs, long-term strategies that set out a pathway to net zero emissions, climate finance commitments to support the most vulnerable, or ambitious adaptation plans and underlying policies, the Asia-Pacific region is already leading the way. In February, Singapore committed to achieving net zero as soon as possible in the second half of the century. In September, China committed to carbon neutrality by 2060. Just a few weeks later, Japan and then Korea committed to net zero by 2050, to name just a few. With each of these new commitments, we take one step closer to achieving the goals that all our governments set ourselves under the Paris Agreement. But we have a long road ahead and the clock is ticking. To move on to carbon pricing in more detail, the headline national targets that have already been announced and that we need to see more of in the run-up to COP26 matter hugely. But what matters just as much are the policies and plans that governments put in place to deliver them. For an ever-growing number of nations, including many in the Asia-Pacific region, carbon pricing is at the heart of those plans. This year saw a carbon tax apply in Singapore for the first time. A few weeks ago, Vietnam passed legislation to underpin a new emissions trading scheme. And early next year, the first trades may take place in China's national emissions trading system, which is set to become the largest in the world. We as the UK government are proud to partner and work with many governments in the region through the World Bank's Partnership for Market Readiness. And we were proud to announce 1 year ago that we would commit £20 million to the World Bank's successor programme, the Partnership for Market Implementation, which makes us the largest donor. The Partnership for Market Implementation will support countries embarking on the design, piloting and implementation of new carbon pricing instruments to help deliver their NDCs. Partnership and support mechanisms like this, and like the International Carbon Action Partnership, will be vital over the next 10 years. But it's not enough for us to simply put a price on carbon. We have to price carbon at a level that will drive new investment in cleaner technology and infrastructure, and which will drive down emissions. This year's World Bank report on the state and trends of carbon pricing reminded us once again that we have a long way to go. The proportion of global emissions covered by a carbon price continues to grow, but still less than 5% of these are priced at the level required to limit warming to 2 degrees. We also have to learn from each other as we develop our policies, building on the experience and lessons of those who have taken the first steps on carbon pricing. In 2002, the UK started our own journey in carbon pricing, setting up the world's first emissions trading scheme. Now, nearly 20 years later, we are embarking on a new chapter, establishing a new approach to carbon pricing following our exit from the EU. We have laid out plans for either a carbon emissions tax or a UK emissions trading scheme to take over once we've left the EU's emission trading system. But regardless of which of those two approaches we take, our commitment to a strong carbon price signal remains firmly intact. This will be vital to delivering our own NDC, which is being finalised as I speak. I know that for many countries in the Asia-Pacific region, the international carbon market will also be vital to your carbon plans over the next decade. COP26 will, of course, be a hugely important moment for this market. But when negotiators meet in Glasgow next November, we very much hope they will be able to overcome their differences and find agreement on the rules underpinning Article 6. We, as the incoming COP presidency, are committed to doing what we can to facilitate this. Our COP president-designate said this to our UK Parliament just a few weeks ago, that the UK will lead a process that brings parties together to find agreement, and that we will do so in a consensus-building way. This matters in terms of the signal that it will send, that governments can come together on even the thorniest of issues within the UNFCCC and agree to universal rules. But it also matters deeply for the purpose of today's dialogue, accelerating climate ambition. The goal of Article 6, as the Paris Agreement itself says, is to support higher ambition in both climate mitigation and adaptation. By collaborating across borders, governments are able to realise more opportunities to reduce emissions at lower cost and with investment by the private sector. And in many cases, these investments can create benefits not just for the planet, but also for local communities, new jobs, cleaner water, and better health. This year has seen a stark reminder of the intertwined relationship between people and our planet. And as we build back from the COVID-19 pandemic over the next few years, we must do so in a way that protects both. We must deliver, as the UN Secretary General said this autumn, a clean, green and resilient recovery. We're convinced that carbon pricing can be an important part of this. As the IEA and others have already pointed out, it can guide investment and spending decisions towards cleaner choices and complement green economic stimulus packages. In COVID-19 and climate change, we have two mountainous challenges that governments have to overcome. We will need all the tools we can get our hands on if we are going to face up to those challenges. And it's clear to us, as I'm sure it's clear to you, that a strong carbon price signal and effective market mechanisms lie at the heart of this. I hope you have a fruitful and enjoyable discussion over the next few hours, which several of my colleagues from the British government will of course be staying to join. And I hope that in a few years' time, when final delegates have packed up and left Glasgow after COP26, we will have moved ourselves a major step closer to meeting the goals enshrined in the Paris Agreement 5 years ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador. A great run through the history and experience that the UK brings to this whole discussion, as well as the facilitating role that you'll be playing this year as president of COP26. So that's a busy year ahead of you, but we hope a very fruitful and productive one. Thank you. We have, I think, a couple of questions here, if I can manage the technology. And I'm so far failing. Here we are. We have a question from Winnie Chen. Will the UK develop their own EU ETS scheme? If so, when will the transition to the new UK scheme be? Are there any publicly available documents on this?
Well, as I said in my speech, we are committed to finding a successor mechanism to the current system. This is intertwined to a degree with our current negotiations on the future UK relationship with the EU. We have made clear that we are open to ideas around connections between a future UK emissions trading scheme and the EU's emission trading system. This is subject to ongoing discussions. Equally, we have also said that we may pursue a carbon emissions tax, but we are clear we will have a mechanism in place next year, and we are clear that that must match our domestic and international carbon climate ambition. Thank you.
Thank you again, Ambassador. I hope this is an evolution which is going to lead the way and can serve as a great example around the world, not least in the Asia-Pacific region today. So thank you very much again. And now I bring the keynote session to a close, and I pass over to Christian for session 1. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Tom, for moderating the first keynote. I think that will give us a very good platform and basic for the next session we are going to have. And it is really a pleasure and honor that we have been able to 3 active policymakers attending to the first session and sharing their insights from a national perspective in 3 different countries in Asia Pacific. Ladies and gentlemen, the postponement of the COP26 in Glasgow to 2021 has delayed efforts to renew climate pledges, but has provided opportunity to couple post-pandemic economic recovery. Plans with long-term climate ambition for this session. I'm very excited that we have 3 active policymakers again, which we can warmly welcome here. We have it from Japan, Philippines, and Indonesia. This session is structured as follows, in a way that we will have at first listen to our speaker in the order as we found it on the agenda, and then go over to question and answer part. Due to this, it's a pleasure and honor to introduce our first speaker, which is Mr. Hideki Makihara, who is in the 4th term member of the House of Representatives, the lower house of National Diet of Japan, and director of the Environment Division Policy Research Council. He has previously served in several key ministerial posts, including State Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry, State Minister of Health, Labor and Welfare, and Parliamentary Vice Minister of the Environment. Thank you, Mr. Makihara, for attending and contributing to our conference today. Mr. Makihara, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Huber. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, thank you, IEA, ICAP, and the KAS recap for organizing this online panel. It is very timely. And it is my great pleasure to have this opportunity to speak to you today. It is my honor to be a panelist together with Representative Edgar M. Charo from the Republic of Philippines, as well as Honorable Julia Loro St. Widya Putri from Republic of Indonesia. My name is Hideki Makihara, and as introduced, I am the Director of Environment Division of Liberal Democratic Party, which has been a ruling party almost all time after 1955. I served as a Parliamentary Vice Minister of Environment, as introduced, from 2013 to 2014. And after that, I served as a Secretary General of the Committee for Prevention of Global Warming of LDP from 2014 to 2015. I was in charge to decide Japan's reduction target of greenhouse gas by 2030 under the Paris Agreement. It is 26% of reduction of GHG at the time of 2030 compared with 2013. After the Paris Agreement in 2016, former Prime Minister Abe's administration decided to reduce GHG by 80% at the time of 2050. Now, after serving as a State Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry until September, I was appointed as the Director of Environment Division under the new Prime Minister Suga's administration. Mr. Suga, who had been a Cabinet Secretary under the Abe administration for 8 years, took the office of Prime Minister on September 16 of this year. On October 6, he made the 26th, he made the first policy speech in which he declared to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, and Japan tries for the decarbonized society. In accordance with the new Prime Minister's sudden declaration, we worked very hard on how to realize such declaration until today. Director General Toshihiro Nikai, the most powerful and well-experienced politician, created the 2050 carbon neutral headquarters in our party, which aims to provide a rough schedule and a menu of measures necessary for 2050 carbon neutrality. As a Director of Environment Policy Division, last week, I made a proposal for the third supplementary budget, which is supposed to be on the table of General Diet session in January of next year. We propose to create a green fund for the research and the development in the field of environment related to technologies in the amount of more than 50 billion USD. Also, we propose to subsidize our lifestyle change, including zero-emission house and a zero-emission automobile. For these weeks, we are discussing about tax measures for the next year. We will employ a new tax incentive for investment on construction of a new factory of high energy efficient products, or on the introduction of high energy efficient facilities and equipment starting from next April. We will take whatever tax measures, budgetary measures, and the regulations to achieve 2050 carbon neutral. The most difficult part of realization of tax neutral 2050 is energy sector. Last time, we set the NDC under the Paris Agreement. We set the strategic energy plan targeted for 2030. There were extremely, very, very tough discussions among interested parties, among others, electricity companies, steel companies, automobile companies, and other manufacturing industries. Under the strategic energy plan, we decide the power supply configuration. Renewable energy, 22 to 24%, nuclear power, 20 to 22%, firepower, to 56%. Renewable energy consists 8.8% to 9.2% hydropower, 7% of solar power, 1.7% of wind power, 3.7 to 4.6% of biomass power, and 1 to 1.1 geothermal. Firepower consists 27% of LNG, 26% of coal, and 3% of oil. Now our target shift to 2050 carbon neutrality. We need to revise such strategic energy plan as well as NDC. In the government, mainly in the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry and Ministry of Environment, discussions have been already launched in related governmental councils. I assume it will be very difficult how to deal with mainly 2 points, nuclear power plants as well as coal power plants. As to carbon pricing, we have 2 similar tax measures already. One is oil coal tax, which levies on oil products, gas, and coal. And the other one is so-called global warming prevention tax, which was introduced in 2012. However, the latter one is just to increase tax rate on the same products. So range is the same. The government has to use the revenue from the increased rate only for prevention measures against global warming, including achieving high efficiency or zero emission energy or batteries and so on. Now we are considering to start carbon pricing in addition to these existing tax measures. However, under very severe economic situation due to COVID-19, and we will have the general elections. This will be the very big election for us. So we believe now is not a good timing to start. So now it is not a good timing. We are considering, but not start yet. Thank you very much. This is Japan's situation.
Thank you, Mr. Akihara. That was very, very interesting to get some insights about the climate policy situation currently in Japan and the very good start for this session. So let me introduce our next speaker, who is Mr. Edgar Chato, representative of the 1st District of Bohol and chairman of the House Committee on Climate Change of the Republic of the Philippines. Mr. Chato is a representative of the 1st Legislative District of Bohol. He is back in the House of Representatives with a fresh mandate after having served 3 terms as the 25th governor of Bohol. He has dedicated his life to public services for 39 years now and has been accorded by the Civil Service Commission the Sentinel Lingtok Bayan Award in the year 2000 and the Dangalgan Bayan Award in the year 2011. So, Edgar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christian. Good day to everyone. And let me first thank the International Energy Agency and Konrad Adenauer Foundation and the International Carbon Action Partnership for hosting this forum. I would like to greet you all in Filipino, isang makalikasang pagbati sa ating lahat. A pro-nature, pro-environment greeting to all. The Philippines, the second most vulnerable country to climate change, joins you in today's workshop as we unite together under one umbrella of concern for our planet and our people. The Philippines, the second most vulnerable country to climate change, in this particular workshop, would like to emphasize that those who made landfall in the country where the typhoons Ophel, Saudel, Molave, Super Typhoon Goni, Chani, Itao, and very recently Typhoon Bangko, which ravaged our country and left a lot of damage to property, affecting millions and leaving at least 69 persons dead. In the light of this catastrophe, it is therefore very timely that the House Committee on Climate Change, which I chair, has filed a House resolution urging the Philippine House of Representatives to declare an environmental and climate emergency, ensuring enhanced and coherent climate actions in the executive and legislative agenda of the government. On 25 November 2020, the Philippine House of Representatives adopted the said House resolution and declared an environmental and climate emergency that called upon major carbon emitters, local industries, and local government units to pursue renewable and sustainable energy sources. This is the first climate emergency declaration of national scope in the country. Together with other leaders of the legislative branch, Senate President Vicente Tito Soto III, Speaker of the House Lord Alan J. Q. Velasco, and Deputy Speaker Loren Legata, we reiterated such a call in a virtual meeting with counterparts from the 48 climate vulnerable forum member countries last week as well. Now, carbon pricing is a market approach that applies the polluter pays principle and is complemented by a necessary shift to alternative renewable energy sources. The Paris Agreement represents rather market approaches such as the carbon tax to support the implementation of the country nationally determined contribution, or the NDC. We may all be aware that carbon pricing is one of the many market approaches to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, GHG, specifically carbon emissions. More specifically, when we put a price on carbon in the form of a tax, we want to hold emitters accountable for their contribution to the accumulation of emissions in the atmosphere and hence increasing pollution, atmospheric temperature, and the accompanying impacts these bring out. Accompanying the application of the polluter pays principle is to discourage use of such carbon dioxide emitting sources of fuel, is the provision of financial incentives to influence these polluters to decrease their emissions by making the shift to cleaner fuels and more efficient processes. The Philippines had long since incorporated market-based instruments in mitigating pollution in the form of emission and effluent trading as embodied in the Philippine Clean Air Act of 1999 and the Philippine Clean Water Act of 2004, respectively. In both laws, trading was supposed to be done among industries within a governing airshed, or in the case of effluent trading, within the water quality management area. Suffice it to say that the implementation of those market-based instruments would benefit from further improvement. Hence, the House Committee on Climate Change has approved the proposed bill on Low Emissions and Climate Resilient Development Act. Under this proposed measure, the Philippine Greenhouse Gas Inventory Management and Reporting System, or the PGHGIMRS, will be institutionalized. The PGHGIMRS will be mandated to take charge of the greenhouse gas inventory management and reporting system in relevant government agencies to enable the country to transition to a climate resilient pathway for sustainable development. The proposed legislation mandates that the Climate Change Commission be the overall lead in the implementation of PGHGIMS. And the CCC shall be responsible for providing direction and guidance in the accounting and reporting of greenhouse emissions and from identified key source sectors in order to develop and maintain centralized, comprehensive, and integrated data on the greenhouse gases. It shall also develop a system for archiving, reporting, monitoring, and evaluating greenhouse gas inventories in all key sectors, as well as provide and facilitate capacity building initiatives in the conduct of the greenhouse gas inventories to ensure application of updated methodologies. Under the proposed measure, the succeeding NDCs shall progressively elaborate and correspondingly adjust policies and measures to obtain the net zero greenhouse gas emissions outcome and the desired resilient state of the country. For this purpose, the CCC, in collaboration with agencies concerned, shall define and set climate resilience indicators and standards to account for climate change impacts and low emissions and climate resilient development priorities and outcomes. Pursuant to the same measure, sustainable finance framework and preferential financial packages for low emission and climate resilient development, as well as low emission and climate resilient public works and auditing of the public sector will also be established. In terms of carbon taxing, the Philippines introduced a carbon tax as part of the bundle of tax initiatives through the train law. In terms of carbon taxing, in December 2017, the Philippine government passed the first of a series of tax schemes designed to increase revenue collection to fund critical infrastructure and social services. And this was signed into law as Republic Act 10963 and dubbed as the Tax Reform for Acceleration and Inclusion, or the Train Law. The Philippine Train Law includes the relevant provisions of the removal of exemption on value-added taxes for several industries, specifically a carbon tax on coal and petroleum products. The responsibility of implementing these provisions falls on the Department of Finance. Done correctly, the DOF estimates that a carbon tax can generate as much as 20 billion in revenue for the Philippine government. The train law is but the beginning of how the Philippines wants to address emissions and economic development as parts of a unified strategy. A tax increase on products or activities that worsen emissions should be coupled with a shift to renewable sources of energy. That is, by making the prices of polluting more costly. We are also slowly shifting towards a low carbon development consistent with our international commitment while also tracing the contours of our own national industrialization strategy. The Philippines is also pursuing other significant corollary or parallel climate-related policy initiatives or prescriptions in support of its economic development. At the end of October this year, following the periodic assessments of the Philippine energy requirements, the Department of Energy declared a moratorium on new coal plants, which was echoed in the House of Representatives Environmental and Climate Emergency Declaration. This announcement adheres to the department's mandate to foster competition in the energy sector and provide reliable and cost-effective power, giving preference to indigenous and clean energy sources. This announcement also augurs well for the Philippines' need to transition to a modern, flexible, and sustainable power system, one that utilizes renewable energy with near zero marginal cost. Further, the Energy Secretary also announced their move to open large-scale geothermal energy exploration to foreign ownerships and equity requirements, the Philippine Renewable Energy Act. This sends a decisive signal to the domestic and foreign investors financing renewable energy and allows the Philippines to be more competitive in the Southeast Asian region. Such an action is complemented by the Central Bank of the Philippines Sustainable Finance Framework. This framework provides environmental, social, and governance safeguards, as well as sustainability principles for the financial system for evolving transition risks, including stranded cost assets, and promotes low carbon opportunities. Similarly, following the declaration of the Department of Energy, the Department of Finance Secretary pronounced that as the country comes out of the pandemic, the country intends to entice more green investments to address climate change and enhance disaster resilience. If only to underscore the urgency, the Bangladeshi president of the Climate Vulnerability Forum called on all countries to fulfill their commitments to the Paris Agreement by submitting their NDCs by midnight of December 31, 2020, the midnight survival deadline for climate. For the Philippines, the NDC represents not only its contribution to emissions reduction, not merely a mitigation or adaptation compendium, but more importantly, it is an investment strategy for low carbon development. It is consistent not just with the global emission reduction effort, but also with the low emission strategies intended to be critically, socially, and economically beneficial. That said, let me summarize the most important considerations on how the Philippines has managed the process with the leadership of President Rodrigo Duterte. If the polluter is expected to pay, it is also in the hope that the polluter eventually makes the shift towards more sustainable, clean energy technologies. We cannot expect carbon pricing to be a standalone strategy in reducing greenhouse gases. The initiative will only be effective if it is within a stable policy framework and sends a clear, consistent, and increasingly strong signal to investors. That is the significance of all the efforts exerted, not only on carbon taxation. The Philippines will submit its enhanced Philippine NDC in accordance with the conditions set by the Paris Agreement. The act of submitting our NDC is not intended to be a simple matter of complying with the Paris Agreement. The matter of legislating laws that create the instruments we can use, such as the Environmental and Climate Emergency Declaration, carbon tax, and the proposed legislation on the low emissions and climate resilient development, serve the twofold purpose of supporting the Philippines' long-term industrialization while also contributing to the emissions reduction towards a better life for all Filipinos. Mabuhay po tayong lahat. Long live. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hector. It was really, really good. You gave us a very, very good insight, starting from the vulnerability of Philippines and how you would like to fight or would like to decarbonize or reduce emission with certain instruments of carbon pricing. Thank you. So now it's a pleasure and honor to introduce our last speaker for this session, which is Ms. Diaro Esti, Member of Parliament in Indonesia, representing the district of Gresik and Lamnungan of East Java, Indonesia. She currently sits in Commission 7, which deals extensively with energy, environment, research, and technology sectors. She is also Secretary of the Green Economy Caucus of the Indonesian Parliament and member of Air Quality Asia. And Ms. Esti founded the Indonesian Energy and Environment Institute, an NGO based in Jakarta, Indonesia. This NGO is dedicated to raise awareness about global warming and its negative consequences of climate change. Dia, it's a pleasure and honor to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christian. And I'd like to also convey my thank you to the IEA, International Energy Agency, and also ICAP, the International Carbon Action Partnership, and also Conrad for hosting such an incredible event. And also I'd like to convey my greetings to Honorable Hideka Makihara, MP from Japan, and also Rep. Edgar Chato from the Philippines. It's an honor. It's really great to be discussing this issue with everybody here today. So thank you again for the kind introduction. I'd also like to add that I am also the Secretary of the Green Economy Caucus, and I'd like to give a little insight about what this caucus is about. It's essentially a caucus which consisting of members of parliament from different committees or commissions within the Indonesian parliament, because we realize that in order to solve climate change, we need to implement a multidisciplinary approach, right? And so it's not only the committee that deals with, for example, the energy sector or research and technology or environment sectors only, but it's also concerning about the pricing. It's also concerning about the environment and infrastructure. So this is really just our way to get politicians, policymakers on one board, right, and creating a sustainable and better future for all. And I'd like to also bring our attention to the fact that we are currently in the middle of multiple crises, right? With COVID-19, we are currently facing a health crisis. With that being said, that's led to an economic crisis, a social crisis, and also we've been dealing with the climate crisis as well for some time now. But one thing that I've learned about COVID-19, just by observation, is that I see that humans are very adaptive creatures. Like, we adapt quite fast, and it's also proof that change can happen, whether it be in a state of crisis, but just generally, you know, we have the capability to change, right? And so what I'd like to remind ourselves is that we shouldn't wait to see more evidence of climate change. In a way, we've seen enough already for us to really just act, right? And really, it really comes down to a matter of priority. And I also believe that this pandemic should act as a fuel for us in realizing the SDGs or SDG goal. So when we're talking about the energy sector, we're also talking about the implementation and realizing SDG 7 of clean and affordable energy for all. And the optimal outcome in this scenario is for us to be able to really just shift our individual national energy mix, whether it be in Asia and the Pacific or really just the world, which in this case is primarily still dominated by the fossil fuel industry, right? It's still fossil fuel, to more sustainable resources, right? So for example, we can attempt to make fossil fuel more environmentally friendly through the process of coal gasification or liquefaction, right? But also more optimally by going for renewable energy. And the implementation of renewable energy generally, I believe that there needs to be a support by a certain regulation, right? And so the political will from nations across the globe is really, really crucial for us to really to see this change that we want to see. And when we talk about the context of Indonesia, we have ratified the Paris Agreement in 2015, and this has been translated into the nationally determined contributions for Indonesia. And it's been passed through law number 16, year 2016, and our general goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 29% in 2030. So the political will is there, political commitment is there as well. And we also have what's called the National Energy Policy. And we have a target of achieving 23% renewables by the year 2025. This in itself is a challenge for us, if I can just say quite honestly, because we are right now standing at 9.15%. And so we have a long way to go, but I'm confident because of the political commitment that I'm able to see right now within the Indonesian parliament alongside with the government. And so given our 23% target, there needs to be a strong synergy between the parliament and also government. This is how our country politically works. In a way, one cannot move without the other. So there is intensive communication, there is intensive communication and collaboration with regards to passing, for example, a certain bill that will help push renewable energy implementation in Indonesia. And when we talk about renewable energy, we have a lot of potential, right? Just a little glimpse of what that looks like, as Honorable Hideki earlier kind of gave us an outline of the renewable energy potential in Japan. I'd like to bring our attention to what that looks like in Indonesia. So we have different sources of energy, whether it coming from the ocean. We have a potential of 17.9 gigawatts. And also there's geothermal. This is quite important because we have 40% of the world's reserves, and that stands at 28.5 gigawatts. And we have bioenergy at 32.6 gigawatts. We have wind as well in certain parts of the country of 60.6 gigawatts. Hydro at 75 gigawatts, and also solar of 207.8 gigawatts. So we have a lot of potential for solar. And just to give kind of like a background of what Indonesia looks like geographically, we are one of the biggest, if not the biggest, archipelago in the world. And so every island has its own specialty, I would say, you know, when it comes to renewable energy resources. So one of our homework is to really understand what potential is there within the different islands that are out there, right? And one of our support through the Indonesian parliament alongside with the government is in achieving the renewable energy bill. Right. And so, of course, in order to achieve this goal, we have to have strong political commitment and strong political will. And I'd like to confidently say that the political will is there, which is wonderful. And luckily, the Renewable Energy Bill has also made it into our priority list of legislations that need to be passed. It's made it for year 2020. And if that doesn't go through, or if we don't finish it by then, it's also been included within the 2021 target. So hopefully, if not this year, the next year. One of our goals is to make renewable energy more competitive within the energy market. And so we're talking about how, you know, the importance of levying a carbon tax, you know, a carbon pricing scheme. As earlier mentioned by Rep. Edgar, you know, this takes into account the negative externalities associated to the fossil fuel industry. One of our biggest challenges is that, you know, renewable energy is not competitive enough. It always loses when we talk about, for example, the coal industry or oil and gas, right? And so I think with the implementation of a carbon tax, this will help it become more competitive within the market, especially when we take into account the externalities, costs associated to that as well. And just a little update as well, if in the context of Indonesia, if we don't do further exploration, Indonesia's oil reserves will last for another 9 to 15 years. And so we are also in a state of an emergency generally when it comes to the energy sector, right? And so there are two choices. One is to ramp up kind of exploration in the country, because we do have a lot of potential, even when we talk about oil and gas in the fossil fuel industry. But I believe that this can also be a motivation for us to really explore the potential of renewable energy implementation in the country, right? This also can be a solution for our state of energy crisis that we're currently facing. And in talking about the renewable energy bill right now, we want to involve the public as much as possible. I feel like this is really important. Being a representative, I represent 2 million people in my district of Gresik and Lamongan that was mentioned earlier as well. And also we recognize that in passing the renewable energy bill, we need to have active discussions across sectors, right? And so what we're doing right now in the Indonesian parliament is opening our doors. We are opening our doors to discuss with the public, whether it be coming from the private sector, public sector, academia, NGOs, communities. We have discussed with various sectors with regards to their input regarding the renewable energy bill and how we can all benefit from this legislation that is very much needed in the country. So this is the latest update right now from the Indonesian parliament. And in general, when it comes to renewable energy implementation, we have several programs that the government is currently working on. So there's the Renewable Energy-Based Industrial Development Program, also the Renewable Energy-Based Economic Development Program. And so this includes the development of the potential for large-scale hydropower and also geothermal power plants in the country, and that is then integrated with industrial developments in the area. So this is something that we're trying to push as well. And also renewable energy utilization to spur regional economies, including in rural areas or areas that are considered to be in the frontier, remote, and also disadvantaged areas within the country. And so that includes developing solar power plants or developing small-scale biomass based on local raw material potential. So there are a lot of different kind of scenarios that are being considered and is taking place in the country. And we also have a lot of potential to install small or large-scale solar panels. As we see before, our potential stems to around 200 and so gigawatts, right? And so this is something that we are currently trying to push as well. And just to wrap up everything I've mentioned, although policies remain one of the most important solutions, I also strongly believe that everybody has a role to play, and we have a saying in Indonesia, which is gotong royong, and that means essentially working together side by side in order to achieve incredible results, right? And so I believe that the government, along with the parliament and CSOs, the academias, private public sectors, the youth, communities, everyone has a role to play. And I think one of the things that we can do today is to recognize what role we play and how we can contribute to the development of a better future for all. So I'd like to end it with that, Christian. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dia. That was very impressive. So especially highlighting the links between this different challenging coming from different sectors. And I just make up some word about the, you talked about the island of Indonesia and the different demands each one has. I see it in the whole world and the whole region through different countries. And that's exactly what we see here in the discussion and the contribution you made. You came from very different background, countries with totally different demands and circumstances, and each one has needs to find its own way to solve this climate crisis. But there seems some common issue by reducing the carbon emission with different measures and methods to do that. So thank you for your contribution, Dia, again. So, and thank you all speakers as well for being that disciplined and time that really allows us some further minutes for a Q&A section. I already see there are coming some question in, so but maybe let me start with some question from my side. Mr. Makihara, you talked about the carbon neutrality target of Japan, which is maybe a very, very important signal to the world coming together with other countries. So from your perspective, or maybe again a bit the individual perception as well from Japan, what is actually the major challenge to reach this carbon neutrality target in Japan? Maybe you can outline this a bit more to us. I think it might be very interesting to what challenges Japan is facing and has to overcome to achieve this goal.
Mm-hmm. The most difficult and major challenge is electricity. As I explained to you, the major electricity production is from fossil fuel, now LNG, as well as coal. And after nuclear plant accident in 2011, it is very difficult to restart the nuclear power plants. We have almost 40 nuclear power plants, but only 3 power plants are now starting. And before the accident, we believe nuclear power plants will be the key measure to achieve carbon neutral or NDC. Now we are losing that measure, so we need to consider the other option, and the other option should be a renewable energy. And the renewable energy, our country is not so big with many populations. So yes, we have broad oceans. So now we are considered to use oceans mainly for wind power. We have already introduced floating wind power. So that can be a key, but the most difficult part for the wind power is the cost for transmission of electricity. So, for example, the Hokkaido is a northern part of Japan. There are many good locations for wind power, but not so many people are there. So we need to move this electricity to like a Tokyo or other major cities, but a long way. And we need to strengthen the transmissions, the electricity wire. So that will cost a huge amount of money. So now we introduced a new law where we can share the cost by all nations, all people, but still, cost will be the challenge. And the fire plant, now it is the last timing we should stop the coal power plants, or we will continue the coal power plants. So now we try to introduce a CCUS, that the utilization of CO2 emitted from these coal plants. So now we success to, capture the CO2 from the emission of coal plants. But we need to, maybe we need innovation to utilize this CO2. So it will take time. So this is, whether we should take time, whether we have enough time to make this innovation, or otherwise we need to stop the coal power plants. But it is very difficult to find the other options. That's our, major challenge.
Perfect. Thank you for outlining this, and I think it's perfectly clear the challenges you see in this regard. Edgar, maybe I come back to you as well and address a question to you. You talked very impressively about the threats Philippines is facing due to the impacts of the climate change, and I think that is really one of the major challenge as well, or directly something we see, which very practically so. And maybe you can give us a bit more idea what the Philippines currently is need to adapt, coming from an adaptation side to the impacts of climate change. Is there something where you think, okay, this is something the Philippines need now to do? Especially to better become, increase the adaptation capacities to the impacts of climate change. You have to unmute, please.
Thank you very much, Christian. I'm here now. The Philippines, as of this point in time, really gives a lot of substance and meaning to the words adaptation and mitigation. Even in the House of Representatives, we have different bodies that also are created as committees. Committee on Climate Change on one hand, and there's also a Committee on Disaster Resilience. The country just also passed a law. From the House, we approved also the creation of a department specifically for that, precisely because disaster, the causes of disasters, the Philippines has been largely attributed to climate change. So we are able to address that more specifically by coordinating with different agencies of government to make sure that legislations are in place, monitoring of the various deliverables that have been committed for the carbon reduction, for example. But on the other side, also more comprehensive approach of national to local collaboration in disaster management, preparedness, including, of course, disaster response and rehabilitation. So these are very, very related things that are being focused. And by the way, this is not only a national agenda, it goes down to the local level. The coordination of national government and local disaster response. And the preparedness side in these events are also being highlighted. And in the case of the addressing the adaptation, we are also very keenly working on putting up things that will make sure our people are prepared and also getting ready for any eventuality. So on both sides, we mitigate the effects of climate change, we contribute to reduction. But as our president also said, we put climate change priority of the agenda, but it must also be with climate justice in it. So the Philippines tries to mitigate the impact of climate change, cooperating with the global community, but at the same time, adapt also to the situations of the current realities. We would like to treat the climate change issues in the same fashion, in the same vigor as we are treating now the pandemic of COVID-19.
Thank you, Edgar. Yeah, there came some question in the chat here, so I tried to reformulate it a bit to include my own question. So I think it's quite a challenge in Indonesia when it comes to yeah, transform or do some kind of energy transition, because there's a huge part of fossil fuel in the energy sector, and emphasizing the importance of renewable energy in the future. This is transition into renewable energy, or the integration of renewable energy in the Indonesian energy mix. So what from your perspective might be the major challenge there, or what would be some good ideas to smooth this process?
Yeah, thank you, Christian. It's quite a challenging question in itself, right? Because it's true. I think shifting from a fossil fuel generated economy to one that is run by the renewable energy, or yeah, energy sources that are considered more environmentally friendly, poses a challenge in itself. But I think it really depends on our perspective as well, right? If we make the renewable energy sector become more competitive, that will mean we can create green jobs, right? Jobs associated to this sector. And by the end of the day, I think one of the major challenges is that not a lot of people are ready for change. Especially when we are very much comfortable being in the fossil fuel industry and having our country run predominantly by the fossil fuel industry. And I think when we brave ourselves enough to move past that, and to see in creating a more sustainable future for the country, then our focus then automatically changes as well. And so I guess my role right now as parliamentarian is to make sure that we have a legislation that can help that can help the transition feel smoother. I think with the policy in place that will in it will discuss things like carbon pricing, how to make it more competitive in the market, how we can also attract investment, how we can make sure that it's not complicated for investors to come to Indonesia. I think this is also one of the challenges that we face within the sector, and also getting people, and hopefully through this bill, people will see that our country has a lot of potential, enough for them to then shift to that sector, right? So this is my, I guess, everyone in my committee or commission, this is our dream really for Indonesia, right? Given our targets as well, given our commitments, but also in understanding that we are in a state of crisis generally. And if I can also convey, Christian, because I saw a couple of comments on the side, somebody was asking about the interconnectedness in Indonesia when it comes to grids. Yes, different islands are interconnected by the grid system. considering also, just to put into perspective, that we have 17,000 islands, more or less. Again, this is, it's the biggest archipelago in the world, and that in itself poses challenges. But what we're trying to push as well, alongside with the government, is to make sure that every island or every area really just explores their individual potentials. And this gives room for us to then install renewable energy power generation as well within these areas. So this is also another solution that we're trying to push alongside the government as well. And also with regard to the carbon tax, somebody was asking, well, is this only specified to the energy sector? From my understanding and from my friends in different committees within the parliament, this is also in discussion with the Ministry of Environment as well, with regards to the forestry sector. So understanding that when we talk about carbon emissions, that comes from different sectors, whether it be the transport sector, the energy sector, the forestry sector, waste sector as well. And so these individual sectors also is considered within the carbon pricing scheme. But fingers crossed, because we are still in the middle of discussing this scheme, and I will let you know as soon as I find out what the final decision is.
Thank you. I definitely would like to know that. So there are meanwhile coming up many questions. There's one very specific question to Mr. Makiara. I just read it for you. So and I think it would be good to have here a brief answer. Mr. Makiara, you touched up the strategic energy plan next week. The country's carbon neutrality will have a big effect on the plan. From that sense, LDP's role, especially yours, is crucial to this end. What would be your top priority to actually implement and get the goal achieved?
Relating to strategic plan? Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, I will reread it. You touched up the strategic energy plan next week. The country's
not next week, sorry.
Huh?
No, not next week. As to the strategic plan, we just started the discussion inside the government. Yeah. Okay. So, we will revise the NDC based on the new revised energy strategic plan by, I think, the next COP 26. So that's our target.
Okay.
So, yeah. So the discussion has just started in the government, not in LDP. LDP internally, we started discussion, but just internally. And the sensitive issue will be, nuclear plant issue as well as coal plant issue. This is very, very politically sensitive. And as I told you, we will have the general election, once a 4 year, and that can be, can lead to the administration change. So this is a very sensitive, politically sensitive moment. So discussion will be very, very difficult.
Well, thank you. I can totally imagine a very, very, very difficult and sensible issue, as you told. Edgar, further question to you in the Philippines. You talked as well about the planned initiative on carbon pricing in the Philippines. So maybe you can give us some more ideas how that from your perspective might affect the energy sector in the Philippines.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. Carbon pricing is now really an evolving strategy to make sure that we are able to bring down the greenhouse gas emissions. And one approach is, of course, on the emission trading or the cap and trade system. And this particular aspect is also very significant when it comes to trading with enterprises and facilities, including the carbon tax. In the case of energy, it is also very interesting that there are always considerations when we establish power plants. So one is cost efficiency, the other one is reliability, and the other one is environment. Environment has become part of a major criteria in securing stable energy in our areas. And that is the reason why in the Philippines, you will see quite a number of laws that relates to environment and also to climate change issues that supports the general feeling that we should all move towards more safe, more clean, and energy. And while it is really true that just like Indonesia, it was quite difficult to move away from carbon, precisely of the perception that it is low in cost. But the ultimate effects also of carbon ends up with more uh, end results cost, which also affects not only health but also the environment as a whole. And these strategies now being employed is looking at viable clean energy sources for the Philippines and making them stronger, in fact, in terms of opening them to foreign investments. This would hopefully, with the pronouncements of the president and the key officials of the Department of Finance and the Department of Energy, this will also give a very strong signal to all investors, both local and foreign, that the country is moving also towards clean energy, and that should give them an incentive to be able to put their investments in the Philippines. So we are exploring other sources of energy away from fossil fuel sources, and it's also gaining grounds in the Philippines. There are also studies being made on reviving a plant for nuclear power. But once again, the energy requirements of the country, because of the growth in population and demand, really also requires more stable, and the framework of developing the energy sector is very, very critical as of this point in time. So again, we are happy to note that the government is presently doing its best, both in legislation and also in, most especially on the execution of the plans of the national government.
Thank you, Edgar. So we're coming to an end for the first session, and we still have a couple of minutes, and we have a lot of more questions here. But I try to bring it a bit together. A lot of questions are finalizing in the question ETS or tax. So maybe when I can take this question and give it to the speaker and give a final comment before we close the session. And my question would be, what is your opinion or your perception or your observation where the region Asia Pacific is going in terms of carbon pricing? Is it more emission trading or more carbon tax? Yeah, that would be my last question to you. Maybe you can give me a very brief opinion. I think there is no right or wrong. It's just something what you observe from your position. Yeah, and then we can close the first session, and maybe Dia, you might start for the final round.
All right, thank you, Christian. Kind of felt like I was put on the spot, but yeah, I think it's really important for us to recognize that every country has their ways in dealing with this, whether it be implementing a carbon tax or you know, a feed-in tariff system or any kind of system. I think it really depends on what works in each area. I think what I'd like to see more of is how countries across Asia and the Pacific, or even the world, can really just help each other. I've conveyed this before, but I think when we talk about climate change mitigation, there needs to be some kind of a collaboration amongst countries, particularly for countries that are already developed and are in a way more well off, you know, and how there can be cooperation, whether it be financial or through you know, technology, or you know, a learning system where developing countries or least developed countries can also benefit from. So having this integration and collaborative way of moving forward is, I feel, something quite important for us to do as well. With regards to the carbon tax scheme in Indonesia, again, this is still being discussed within the parliament, but let alone also, most importantly, within the government. And so this, I think, one of the things that I'd like to propose is also, if there are and when there is more updates on this, I will be more than happy to share with everybody here, just to keep everybody updated with the decisions that are taking place in Indonesia. So I'll leave it with that, Christian. Thank you.
Thank you, Dia. Mr. Makihara.
Thank you very much. And this is a very important panel, I believe, because we three of us are politicians. So politicians must win the election. That is the most difficult part. And as Ms. Petri said, I think education to the people is very important. That's a key element. Otherwise, we just lost the election by introducing carbon pricing. So, EU is developed in that sense, very, very developed. So we'd like to learn the experiments from the EU and other countries, and let's work together. So carbon pricing, the details is, we will discuss after the election, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you. Edgar, final. You have to unmute.
Yes, I think I have to bring back again the proposed legislation in the House of Representatives on low emissions and climate resilient development act, which is now pending in the House of Representatives. We just approved it at the committee level, and it will now be on plenary. Because the two very important points to stress, whether it's emission trading or it's carbon tax, these are strategies to reduce emissions. But we have also to consider the fact that the overall strategy must also impact into capacity of the community to contribute to greenhouse gas emissions reduction. At the same time, look at the overall impact of the costs on every individual consumer for power, for example, and all. So the balancing really is very important. It's very challenging, and it is something that has to be carefully studied. I mentioned earlier that the Philippines has already started its own measures along this line, and we have pending legislations. Discussions on those particular areas would, of course, carry with it a consideration on the overall net effect of the net cost, for example, on the people as well. So that's very critical. So a lot of data has to be gathered and generated. It is important that all the database factors are being inputted so that we are able to go through the challenges along the way. We are supporting the idea of getting more involved, even in the Asian region, on discussions for the carbon pricing issue, as it will also enhance our policy development and our possible legislations in contribution to national growth and regional development as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Dia. Thank you, Edgar. Thank you, Mr. Hideki Makihara, for your time and sharing your perspective, your opinion, and your perspective to this important topic with all of us. I learned a lot here. We have almost 100 participants, which I think learned as well a lot, and have as well a lot of questions. So we will find some kind of solution to bring these questions to you and facilitate maybe some ongoing dialogue on this important topic. But again, let me thank you for your contribution in attending to this important conference. And now we have, I close this session, and we will now have a break of 15 minutes, which we have already jumped in. So in 10 minutes, more or less, we will meet us again here. So keep online, and thank you again for your time. Bye-bye.
Okay. So good morning, good afternoon, everybody. And firstly, many thanks to all of our speakers that have preceded the session. I thought it was a fantastic discussion in the last panel, particularly outlining not only the challenges, but where the real opportunities of a low carbon transition lie for jurisdictions in the region. We will now move to our second panel for the day, and we have again an excellent lineup of speakers representing jurisdictions that are implementing carbon pricing instruments within the Asia Pacific region. And so I would just like to invite the panelists to switch on their cameras if they have not done so already. Hi, Kay. Okay, perfect. So welcome everybody. For this panel, we will have 4 speakers represented by Kay Harrison from New Zealand, Medrazam from Indonesia, Yan Wei from Singapore, and also Wang Jijie from China. So it's set to be quite a busy session, but I will do my best as moderator to both get us through the interventions and also come to your questions in the chat. I think I will introduce the speakers just before their intervention. And to get us started, it will be the Honourable Kay Harrison from New Zealand. So Kay is the Climate Change Ambassador of New Zealand, and she has been a central piece of the climate policy landscape in New Zealand, working for years as the lead negotiator for the international carbon markets through the UNFCCC process, while at the Ministry of Environment, but also heading the Climate Change Directorate that is in charge of the implementation of New Zealand's emissions trading system. So without further ado, Kay, the floor is yours.
Thank you, William. I hope you can hear me. Give me a thumbs up if you can. That's excellent. Thank you. Well, good evening, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much to the organisers of this event. And thank you for inviting me to be one of the panelists at this time. Particularly have been asked to speak on the topic of carbon pricing within New Zealand's climate change strategy and policy mix. In the description of the session, carbon pricing is described as an indispensable tool, and I couldn't agree more. And I'm in good company there. The UN Secretary General also thinks carbon pricing is pretty indispensable in the fight against climate change. I don't think he got the idea from me, but you know, I'll claim it. Anyway, let me start with some history with respect to New Zealand and carbon pricing. We established our emissions trading system in 2008. And those were the old days, for those who've been around long enough. It was when we were part of the Kyoto Protocol, and the Kyoto Protocol had within it international emissions trading. So we built an emissions trading system that would kind of mesh within the Kyoto Protocol emissions trading system. Over 12 years, we have had to address a number of issues, as you do when you have an emissions trading system. Things go wrong, and it was a right royal battle to get it first. It was will we have a tax or we have an ETS, that kind of phase that many of you are familiar with. After Paris in 2015, we realised that this we had built around was no longer appropriate. And so we initiated a significant reform. And I have some key messages, I guess. It's really good to have an emissions trading system. It's really good if you've still got it after 10 years. It takes time and it takes maintenance. And you need to design it for your own economy and for your emissions profile. But you can still cooperate with other systems. That's the big advantage over a tax, in my view. Our ETS doesn't, oops.
Sorry, Kay, I think, Kay, you are, we can hear you, but you're coming a little bit broken up and a bit delayed. So I think the IT just switched your camera off to see if we get a more stable connection. I hope that's okay.
Okay, well, I'll just talk and then I don't need to worry about how my face is looking as well. Good. Okay, so yeah, our ETS does not look like the EU ETS. We don't have a lot of installations that are responsible for our emissions. We have one coal-fired power station that's old and is due to shut down. We have one aluminium smelter that's also due to shut down, for example. But we do have a lot of emissions from cars and trucks and cows and sheep. Also some from industrial processes, but it's a very diffuse kind of set of emissions. We also have significant risk around deforestation. Well, about a of our country is locked up, if you like, as native forest, as protected, we also have private landowners who have a lot of plantation forestry. If they decided to change the land use of that plantation forestry, we could be responsible for significant emissions. And to avoid that deforestation and to build in incentives for further forests, we designed our ETS to include forestry. So here I would say the ETS alone in our policy mix is not sufficient. For example, transport fuels are within our ETS. Price that is passed through to the consumer at the gas station is a matter of only a few cents a litre, and that is not going to deliver the incentive for fuel switching. So we will need to deliver other policy measures to electrify our transport system. Now, there have been two big areas of reform that I wanted to mention. One last year was the introduction of our net zero 2050 target, and that actually shapes everything. That having that long-term target is absolutely critical. And we follow very much the UK model in establishing an independent and expert climate change commission who recommend to the government carbon budgets, 5-year carbon budgets, that the government is really pretty much obliged to adopt, because these budgets are stepping stones to the 2050 neutrality target. And the government is obliged to deliver a plan on how it's going to meet those budgets. And this links to the emissions trading system and its cap. All of these components will help deliver our long-term target. The second area of reform has been on the ETS itself, and there in that shift from a Kyoto kind of system to a more conventional system, we set a declining cap in line with the emissions budgets. We established auctioning rather than just relying on the incentives in forestry to provide allowances that could be purchased or through trade from those who receive free allowances. And we established a cost containment reserve, triggered if the price gets over $50 in the first instance, and a price floor at auction of $20. We're also initiating a phase out of industrial allocation, increasing penalties for non-compliance. We've got more to do on things like market governance. But probably the most interesting thing is the aspect of agriculture. Around 50% of our emissions are covered in the ETS already, and 50% of our emissions come from agriculture. So there's a constant debate within our country about whether or not farmers and farm processors are cheap and the methane that they emit should be covered in the ETS. Not exactly like an installation in Europe, is it? But right now, a group of stakeholders, the government and farmers and others are working together to design an appropriate pricing regime for agriculture to help reduce agricultural emissions. We're also investing in research, etc., but agricultural emissions will be priced. If that group does not make sufficient progress, then they will go straight into the emissions trading system. If they can come up with a better way of pricing other than the emissions trading system for agriculture, then that is what will be delivered. That is unusual. Many countries around the world subsidize agriculture. We will price those emissions. So that's a bit of a description of our history, of our experience. I would recommend an ETS over a tax. It does take work, but it's as the description said, an indispensable tool, and we couldn't do without it. And I'll stop there, William, if that's okay.
That was perfect, Kate. Thank you so much. A quick question from my side before we move on along the panel. As you mentioned, New Zealand has, I guess, over a decade of experience with this instrument and has gone through some significant reforms. Is there anything that you would like to communicate to those jurisdictions that are just about to start the process of setting up an emissions trading system that you think is sort of any like sort of advice from going through the process, or anything that you think is important to maybe implement in the first stage, which New Zealand has learned from their own experience in the past?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is an expression, native language, kia kaha, which means be courageous, be brave, because it's hard work. I think for us, we learned a great deal from Australia, and in fact, we borrowed a huge amount of material from Australia, and you can do that, and people will share. I think my advice would be take time. And I think do as the Chinese are doing, sector by sector, but also make sure your design is suitable for your country and your profile and works for you. But you need to invest a great deal as well in taking the people with you. It is a polluter pay system. It makes enormous sense, but it does get a lot of aggravation, and we had farmers driving tractors up the steps of Parliament in protest. So that's something to look forward to. Thanks, William.
Okay, excellent. Many thanks, Kane. We're looking forward to coming back to you as part of the discussion. But I would like to move to Dr. Medrazam, who is the Director for Environmental Affairs at the Indonesian Ministry for National Development and Planning. Dr. Medrazam is one of Indonesia's experts in forest and climate change issues and has chaired the Indonesian delegation in financial climate change negotiations under the UNFCCC from 2005 to 2008. So we're absolutely delighted to have you as part of the panel, and really looking forward to hearing more about Indonesia's experience.
Okay, thank you very much, Williams. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, greeting to everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be part of this important discussions. I really appreciate the excellent collaborations between International Energy Agency IEA and also ICAP and also KAS for gathering experts and sharing ideas on carbon pricing policies in this Asia Pacific regions. In this opportunity, as I'm working at the Environment Unit in the National Development Planning Agency, I would like to share our review about the carbon pricing stance in the context of state development plan. I believe when we discuss about in-country mitigation and climate action strategies in both medium terms and long terms, I think we need to recall back again our Article 3.4 of the UNFCCC, stating that the parties have a right to and should promote sustainable development. Policies and measures to protect the climate systems against human-induced change should be appropriate for the specific conditions of each party and should be integrated with national development programs. I underline here, should be integrated with national development programs. And taking into account that economic development is essential for adopting measures to address climate change. And we in Indonesia have done this. We have integrated climate targets and mitigations actions into our medium-term development planning document through Low Carbon Development Initiatives Framework, or we usually call it LCDI. Within this framework, we are not only aiming to achieve our climate targets, but also maintaining our economic growth in the long run. No trade-off between economic growth and emission reductions. That's what we aim for. Therefore, our goals to move towards low carbon economy, of course, that will require a huge amount of investments, advanced technologies, and also innovations. Carbon pricing policies is considered as one of instruments to address these challenges. The conversation about carbon pricing recently, I think it's already emerged around the globe, yeah, including in Indonesia as well. And in Indonesia, basically we are now in ongoing process to establish our own carbon pricing regulations. in the next 2 hours, actually, I have a big meeting actually to discuss about carbon pricing regulations. Thus far, Indonesia is focusing on 3 possible mechanisms for carbon pricing. The first, of course, is about carbon trading through emission tradings and offsets. And the second one, result-based payment. And I think we have already worked together very closely with our colleagues with Norwegian government and right now with the World Banks on the result-based payments. And also the other possible instrument with regards to carbon tax. We still discuss this carbon tax with colleagues in the Ministry of Finance as well. And while equally amenable to other mechanisms informed by scientific and also technological advances. Yeah. As an instrument to support our national development targets to achieve Paris agreements, we really believe that carbon pricing should be put within the framework of the low carbon development initiative in Indonesia. Our office actually has already released the LCDI report, Low Carbon Development Initiative report last year, highlighted that carbon pricing policies are essential to advance our LCDI scenario towards decarbonization. The LCDI plus scenario, even outlined in the report, indicated that for moving towards low carbon development path, it will require more ambitious scenarios and assumptions, including significant increase of share of the renewable energy in the energy supply and also energy efficiency improvement. Implementing carbon pricing policies in the longer terms, of course, will advance transitions toward a more ambitious climate targets. Even though carbon pricing policies are mainly implemented with the objective to support the achievement of emission reduction targets, we really believe that the countries will get co-benefit in terms of economic and developments. I think in the COVID era 19, we cannot just talk about emission reductions only. We have to think about green investment. We have to think about how do we provide green jobs and so on. So I think for this carbon pricing, we really believe that this could increase our green investment for new technologies and innovations by utilizing revenues gathered from carbon pricing. And we could also increase and internalize of our external cost of carbons in terms of in this green investment, so then we can improve our competitiveness as well with regards to the renewable energy compared to fossil fuel base. And also we really expect, again, a green investment could improve or create more green jobs that will contribute to our long-term economic growth that is more sustainable and resilient in the long terms. In the closing remarks, in the context of long-term mitigation strategies, Indonesia has already committed on the climate actions to be based on national development planning process with strong legal basis to ensure mitigation actions are implemented. And right now, Indonesia actually, we will develop our long-term development planning document, so-called RPGPN, for the period of 2025 to 2045. And we believe that this is our opportunity to embed low carbon development and green economy framework, including carbon pricing scenario in our long-term national development plan. I think I stop my contributions here. Thank you very much, William. I hand it over back to you.
Many thanks for that really clear sort of update on where Indonesia's at with their carbon pricing development. Maybe just one follow-up question, Dr. Medreslam. Is there clarity over the time frame under which a decision will be made over the various instruments that are under consideration, and then also a plan as to at what date Indonesia hopes to see a carbon pricing policy implemented?
Well, basically, we are still discussing this quite tough actually internally, and there is a target as well by the president that we have to release this in a very short term. But I cannot promise you when actually the exact date. But we really hope that within the next few months we will release this carbon pricing regulations in Indonesia.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that additional piece of information. Something we'll be keeping a close eye on. Sorry. So I would now like to come to Mr. Jian Wei. Jian Wei is the Director of Policy and Planning Division for the National Climate Change Secretariat, the strategy group under the Prime Minister's office in Singapore. He leads the policy and planning team to direct efforts across the Singaporean government to develop and implement Singapore's response to climate change and advance their interests on the international stage. So very much looking forward to hearing about Singapore's carbon tax, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, William. Can you hear me? Okay, good. Thanks for the introduction. I was going to introduce myself, but since you have done so, I'll jump straight into the presentation. I will be sharing Singapore's experience on carbon pricing. Next slide, please. So, notwithstanding that Singapore is an alternative energy disadvantage, we are very serious about our climate ambition. So, in the height of COVID in March earlier this year, we submitted our enhanced NDC as well as our LEDS. The slide is quite self-explanatory, but I'll just highlight 3 points. We have 3 strategic thrusts that will help us achieve our NDC and LEDS. Number 1, transform our industry, economy, and society. Number 2, adopting low carbon technologies like hydrogen and CCUS, and finally, number 3, effective international cooperation. Next slide, please. This slide shows the slates of mitigation measures we have put in place across all sectors, ranging from power generation all the way to waste and water. You will see at the middle of the slide that our carbon tax complements these measures by providing an economy-wide price signal to encourage emissions reduction. The carbon tax also helps to incentivize research, development, and deployment of advanced low carbon technologies. Next slide, please. To ensure a clear and transparent price signal across the economy, we have decided to implement a simple and clean carbon tax system without any exemptions. As you can see in the slide, from 2019, last year, to 2023, $5, and then we will do a review by 2023 with a view to increase it to $10 to $15 by 2030. I'm talking about Singapore dollars here, so the US dollar conversions are on the slide. That's it. To manage our administrative burden, we are setting a carbon tax threshold of 25 kiloton of carbon dioxide equivalent. This allows a carbon tax to cover about 80% of Singapore's emissions, and this is amongst the highest coverage for any carbon price in the world. Next slide. And sorry, next slide, please. I think I skipped a slide. Sorry about that. I was going to say our mitigation efforts are fiscally costly. So to this end, we designed our carbon tax such that the revenue we collected is set aside to support energy efficient grants to help industry reduce their emissions. This augments the price signal of the carbon tax to nudge companies to become more carbon efficient and better prepared for a low carbon future. For the first 5 years of the introduction of the carbon tax, we are prepared to invest more than the revenue we collected to support worthwhile industry projects. Next slide, please. Carbon tax affects also companies in the power sector, and in turn, this will result in pass-through of the carbon tax to households. Even though the impact, the initial impact at $5 per ton is very small, less than 1% increase in electricity tariffs, the Singapore government has put in place transitional assistance of 20 Singapore dollars per year from last year to next year to help lower and middle income households offset part of the utility bills. This helps ensure that the households not only are not too adversely affected, even while they adjust their consumption patterns to be compatible with a low carbon future. Next slide, please. So as I've mentioned before, Singapore is an alternative energy disadvantage. So we are exploring the use of international carbon credits as we move into a low carbon future. So to this end, we have also designed our carbon tax policy with a longer term outlook so as to prepare for such a future. In particular, we have put in place a mechanism to accommodate the use of carbon credits in the future to prepare ourselves where there is a set of credible global rules on international carbon trading with a global carbon price. We are prepared to link our carbon tax framework to external carbon markets as and when this becomes feasible. Our mechanism helps to build capacity as well as capability in our domestic ecosystem and prepares our companies for such a future. Next slide, please. I've talked quite a bit about the policy considerations of our carbon tax. Let me talk about the process. As you can see in the slide, the timeline spans from 2010 to 2019. So although we have implemented our carbon tax only last year, conversations started as early as 2010 when the Singapore's Prime Minister communicated the need for a carbon price if there is a global deal on climate change. So subsequently, as you can see on the slide, I won't belabor you with the details, but we had many rounds of consultations with companies as well as the public. We have also commissioned studies to help us understand what kind of mechanisms suit us best. Finally, we made an announcement in 2017 before passing the Act in 2018 and implementing in 2019. Next slide, please. This will be my last slide. In our experience, carbon pricing plays an important part of our suite of mitigation measures as Singapore heads towards a low carbon future. So some key lessons we have learned from carbon pricing journey. One, to start the conversation as early as possible and consult widely, because that is what is needed to get buy-in. Two, provide a transitional period to give companies and households time to adjust to their emissions, to new emissions patterns. And three, actively identify opportunities even in an implementation of a tax. So in our case, we took the opportunity to develop to try to develop a carbon services sector and associated capabilities, lays the groundwork and foundation as we embark on the green recovery post-COVID and grow our green economy. So I hope my presentation has given other countries exploring a carbon tax food for thought. Thank you.
No, thank you, Tian Wei. That was really excellent and great to hear from as you mentioned, a very simple and clean approach to carbon taxation in Singapore. One thing that I'm fascinated by is the fact that the tax does not provide any exemptions or sort of rebates as we see to the trade exposed sectors or the emission intensive trade exposed sectors to protect against competitiveness. And I was wondering if you could provide a little bit more of a perspective as to how that came about, what the experience has been, and also whether that will be the expectation going forward with the scheduled increases to the carbon tax.
Thanks very much, William. So really, we see the value of a clear and simple price signal because we want companies to adjust their behaviors accordingly, and having carve-outs inadvertently will be a different way because I understand that different countries have different ways of implementing it. They may have a higher headline tax rate with a carve-out, but on our end, we prefer to use a cleaner single instrument, which is a price signal. And the other point is that actually the world is aiming towards net zero. So if our objective is zero carbon emissions, then once you have net zero at the company level or at the nation level, then you don't have to pay for carbon tax, which makes sense in the long grand scheme of things. In terms of consultation and approach, I think I've mentioned that we have engaged quite early on and laid the groundwork so that when, in fact, the announcement for raising the carbon tax to 10 to 15 Singapore dollars was made in, I believe, in 2017. So the lead time for industry is actually a good 7 or 8 years before implementation. So I would say companies are prepared to, and as far as I understand, when I speak to companies internally, even when they look at their own investments, the carbon price they impute internally seems to be higher than the rate that we are taxing them. So I think companies are prepared for the shift. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Many thanks for that additional perspective. So I would now like to turn to our final panelists, and if you're following along on the agenda, this might come as a bit of a surprise, but we have had a last-minute inclusion from Wang Jie, who is a researcher at the Market Mechanisms Research Department of the National Center for Climate Change Strategy and International Cooperation in China. He's a member of the Chinese government delegation to the United Nations climate change negotiations, undertaking research on China's upcoming national carbon market, as well as the international trading mechanism. And Wang will be providing us with an update now on the always very much anticipated national emissions trading system in China. So thank you very much for joining us, Wang.
Thanks, William. I'm really glad to have this opportunity to learn from other colleagues and share my thoughts on carbon pricing policies role in the long-term mitigation strategies based on our experiences. As far as I'm concerned, carbon pricing policies could be an important part of our climate change policy box, which could help us price greenhouse gas emission and promote the decarbonization process of our society. We all know the carbon price policies could have different patterns or methods like carbon tax or carbon or ETS. In China, we choose the ETS, we choose the market pathways. And I believe we started our ETS establishment since 2011. At that time, we started our pilot carbon markets. And we started our pilot from 5 provinces, 5 cities like Beijing, Tianjin, Chongqing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen, and 2 provinces, Hubei provinces and Guangdong province. At that time, although the NDRC, our National Development and Reform Commission, at that time, this ministry responsible for the establishment of ETS in China, offer the guidance for design and implementation of ETS pillars. The key feature of ETS are varied from different pillars. They try to cover different industries or sectors based on their own local characters. And the transaction scale of 7 pillars is roughly 400 million tons, and which is equal to near 9.3 billion RMB until this August. According to their research, the 7 ETS pillars have played an important role in the local government low carbon intensity targets and controlling greenhouse gases emission, which promotes the performance of reducing emission in pilot areas and facilitates economy transformation towards a low carbon future. Also, as you have just mentioned, China is now establishing our national ETS systems. In this regard, we launched our national markets from 2017, the end of 2017, and we plan to start it from our power sectors, which is important emission industries, maybe in the whole world. We are now taking advices from relevant ministries and publics along this allocation or other key areas of our mechanism designs. Also, we insist to promote our entities, our potential entities, capacity building, and to promoting our emission trading law process. Based on our experiences, generally, I believe carbon pricing policies like emission trading system could help us achieve our long-term goal by mainstreaming our 3 aspects. Firstly, policies like ETS could cover the main industries and emitters. Carbon pricing policies could make relevant entities to pay for their emission and promote them to take the cost into account when they set their market strategy. Government sectors could also try to limit covered in industries emitters emission scales through cap and trade and other methods. According to our policy experiences, ETS could surely contribute to achieve local carbon reduction targets. And I think this may be also the experiences from other countries. Secondly, I think carbon pricing could send a clear signal to the market. In this regards, it will not only let emitters to participate in this system. I mean the emitter, I mean the covered entities, but also if we have a carbon pricing policies, we could lay a basis for other participants like financial service industries to play a role in this process towards our long-term emission reduction targets. According to our statistics, like I have just mentioned, the whole pilot system has roughly, the transaction is near 9.3 billion RMBs. I think the part of them are from covered entities, and the rest maybe all from the institutional investors, which is certainly contribute to our
I think we lost his connection.
It does seem
under
like
such systems, entities will try to take meaningful reduction measures, which will improve their competitive capacities in the future. Meanwhile, these measures could help us to adjust our energy structures and other key index, which is very important for us to fulfill our long-term commitments. I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wang. It's clear that China will focus to begin with on the power sector, but I think it's been signaled in the past, and we also see this in the Chinese pilots, that there are also some important industry sectors that may also come under the scheme at a later date. And so, could you provide a bit of a perspective on which sectors might be in line for that, and what's currently going on to prepare the ground to actually introduce these sectors into a later emissions trading system?
Oh, thank you for your question. It's really a tough one, really. Yes, I believe that according to our president Xi Jinping, and at that time maybe the Barack Obama, the president of the United States, our announcement has mentioned we will have roughly 8 industries in our national carbon markets. I think after the power sectors, the rest of industries will take measures, or will. If you want me to give you a specific one for these things, I really need to take more research. But I think we will take the rest industries step by step, which will to expand our market scales to make our markets more efficiency. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have about 20 minutes now, where I would like to invite Kay, if you could try to turn your camera on and see if we get a stable connection for you. Otherwise, also great to have you sort of just through the phone. But I think there's some really interesting and important questions that have come up through the chat. And the first one that I'd like to touch on is basically the support for carbon pricing in your jurisdictions. And so the question was specifically about whether there's any polling data which indicates what basic public support for the carbon pricing mechanisms are. But I would like to generalize it and sort of, so if there's information on that, that would be fantastic. But if not, I would also be interested to understand also how in your jurisdictions, really, you've reached a political consensus around the carbon pricing is the right way to go? Because I mean, we see in other jurisdictions, some not too far from New Zealand, for example, that this is still a topic that's hotly contested. So I think it would be fantastic to just get an understanding on how this came about and whether there's any lessons that can be learned from this as to how to bring actually carbon pricing into the discussion in a way that basically leads to multi-party support. Maybe Kay, could we start with you?
Sure. When I read that question, I thought, I wonder if anyone's ever done a poll on support for taxes, because I don't think we have a poll that says people support the ETS, but I know we've had the ultimate poll, and that is an election or several elections in which the ETS has continued to be supported by both of the major parties. That's not a given, and as you were alluding to, in countries close to New Zealand, elections can spell the end of an ETS. So I don't know what the recipe of success is, but once you've got it, hang on to it and try and engage with politicians from different parties in understanding that it's better to have something than to keep changing what you have. Thanks.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. And Jan, also, what's the experience from Singapore here?
Can I jump in? Yes. The interesting thing is that Singapore does have a survey on this. We have a climate change perception survey. In the 2019 edition, more than 75% of respondents are prepared to play their part, even if they are expected to bear additional costs. So this is not specific to the carbon tax per se, but I think the understanding that there's some trade-offs as we put more emphasis on the environment and sustainability, and I would say generally there's support for that. Thanks.
Excellent. And maybe just before we move to the other panelists, I can follow up on another question that was there for those that have sort of have carbon pricing policies in place. So, you know, what we're really trying to do is with the carbon price is change the relative costs in the economy and make fossil-based products more expensive. But we also understand that this can have a disproportionate effect on low-income households. So I was wondering from both of your perspectives, how this has been addressed in your relative systems, and yeah, exactly. So maybe we can start with you, Jianwei.
Sure. And so in Singapore, at least at the current price level of about 5 Singapore dollars per ton, it affects electricity tariffs by about 1%, actually less than 1%. So we don't think that is significant, because prices do fluctuate, and we think 1% is within bounds. That said, we are not sure what the future for carbon tax trajectory is. I mean, we have some certainty for up to 2030, but beyond that, we don't know. And realistically, it's going to be higher than lower. So I would say that's something we are mindful of. We have provided some transitionary support, 20 Singapore dollars per household in the first 3 years of the carbon tax implementation. And the reason why we actually phase out the support is because we want households to change their behavior as well. Because at the end of the day, if there's no impact and we fully subsidize it, then actually there's no change in behavior, and we won't achieve the shift that you talked about. So really, we are hoping for households to do more. At the same time, we also have campaigns in Singapore asking for more embracing circular economy principles, increasing recycling rates, etc. We are going to step up our efforts next year. So hopefully that's something that we can look forward to.
Many thanks. And Kay, did you also wanted to comment here on how the New Zealand system has been designed to sort of make sure that we have an equitable transition?
Yeah, I think it's a two-edged sword, because we find as well that the additional cost to households is not great. And on the one hand, that is a good thing. On the other hand, unless people feel a price, the full price is now passed through, but if they don't feel the price, then they don't necessarily change behavior. We have put in place some things like a winter fuel subsidies for low-income households. But that's designed to, that's targeting particularly low-income families who are facing higher costs for all sorts of reasons, so rather than the ETS itself. But as I said, if you don't face a significant price or a price that you notice, then you're not likely to switch fuel. The people that I guess have noticed it most would be some of the small businesses who have coal-fired boilers or have coal-fired heating arrangements for their hot houses and things and growing vegetables. We provided an incentive before the ETS to switch fuels at that point and credit people with projects to reduce emissions before they faced an ETS price. And that's another good thing to do, by the way, if you're introducing an ETS, is to start with a scheme where the early movers or the early adopters of innovation and technology can demonstrate how emissions can be reduced by fuel switching, and reward them first before it becomes a covered ETS.
Yeah, fantastic. And again, great advice for jurisdictions that are sort of just starting this journey. And so, Dr. Middlesam, in Indonesia, what can I ask what the state of public support is for carbon pricing as a key part of the NDC, and also what your perspective is on these issues, particularly with the discussions that you're having at the government level at the moment.
Thank you, William, for the questions. And I think, with regards to carbon pricing, I think we try to follow what we call the intentions to have a better, good investments actually. What I mean here is actually we just cannot rely upon the government investment. We have to do more on to get more support on the private investments, including also the from the carbon pricing source or mechanisms. Since we have already calculated that we need to have a big amount of investments if we want to achieve more NDC ambitious targets on our NDC. So this carbon pricing basically has been discussed in the cabinet as well, and it seems to us that there are a lot of of course in some parts of the community, of course they tend to support, but in some parts of community also tends to question these policies. But in the government context, I think we really need to have a lot of support from the markets as well. So we cannot just rely upon the government investment only. So basically, the government still keep pursuing this, although we have to be very, very careful in designing the mechanisms as Honorable Kemi mentioned as well, that it's not easy, to design this in a whole aspects of the country. So, but we need to design this in a very careful manner, as we know Indonesia is a big country, it's a complex country. We have a different types of community. We have a different types of incomes, which quite the disparity of income is quite high. So that's why I think we need to have a very careful design on our carbon pricings. As I mentioned, we have three mechanisms actually that we would like to pursue. First, the result-based payment. I think the result-based payment is already ongoing at the moment, but for the carbon trading, and in particular for carbon market, this is a very sensitive issue. And basically, we are still doing some study in this case. And for the carbon trading, just a few weeks ago, our colleague from the Ministry of Energy right now has already released a so-called a voluntary mechanism. This is a kind of piloting activities to test the readiness of our carbon pricing mechanisms, in particular in energy sectors. But this is still a test. We want to see some reactions also from the privates and also from the publics when we try to impose these carbon pricing mechanisms, in particular in the energy sectors. But we believe this is the way to go, and but of course we have to do it in a very careful manner. Thank you, Pak.
Thank you. And also to Wang, I mean, I was wondering, I mean, you've had the Chinese pilots have been operating for I mean, since 2011. And what's your perception on whether there's public support for these instruments?
Oh, I think from our policy appearances, I think the major citizens or industry entities, they roughly support our mechanisms, not only in some developed or some advanced cities like Beijing, like Shanghai, but also like some large experiences, less provinces like Guangdong or Hubei. They're still facing a lot of challenges, but they have really take great efforts to fulfill their market targets to achieve all the carbon pricing goals. Along with, you could think about from roughly all our pilots markets, and each year our compliance rate roughly all compliance rate are around 100%, and these figures show that all the pilots covered entities, although they need to pay for the cost, while the other non-pilots provinces competitors don't need to have this burden, but they still insist on this one. And as the citizens, we have, as I mean, also in nowadays, we have to want to listen to the advances from the public, from the society citizens, to let them know. And we think that the citizens really have their enthusiasm or their willingness to participate, to play a role in the carbon markets mechanisms. And from all these aspects, we have create relevant products for them to have a method to buy or sell their credits or something like that from like our pellets in Guangdong. They have set the exact products, and others like some NGOs that also promote all the process in China. I think this program goes quite well, and I think the citizens will not only to learn from this license, but also they want to make some contributions from their own selves. I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. So I'd like to change track a little bit now as well. I think that so in a world without COVID-19, we would have been discussing the Article 6 negotiations at about this time of the year. And so we have, given the sort of makeup of the panel, I'd be really interested to get your take on what role Article 6 sort of could play in the future carbon markets, and how this could potentially interface with the domestic systems that you have set up. So I think if we can start with Kay first.
Great. Well, thank you for that question, William. And I don't know whether I'm relieved or sad not to be working on Article 6 right at this moment and in the negotiations. I know that many countries are getting underway with cooperation, country to country, in that context. I guess I imagined in a system where we have an emissions trading system that it would be possible for us to link with another system, and we would have to, in addition to allowing the emitters to participate in auctions at another jurisdiction or a recognition of units from another system, we would need some kind of arrangement country to country to address the accounting of international transfers of mitigation between countries. And I think when you imagine ETS linking, such as California and Quebec, you would imagine that Canada and the US would have come to an understanding about the number, the net kind of transfer of ITMOs, if you like, that would be permitted by those two jurisdictions, because under the Paris Agreement, that transfer of mitigation must be authorized by the parties. So that's one way in which Article 6 might mesh. Another way might be for a jurisdiction to purchase offsets from another jurisdiction. So that might be a project-based relationship between two countries. So for example, Switzerland and Ghana, or Switzerland and Peru. It's possible that the ETS jurisdiction might purchase those offsets but as a government, and then auction them in to the ETS, for example. So there are various different ways in which I think this could be operationalized, and yeah, it's exciting to see it develop. Thanks.
Excellent, many thanks. Do any of our other panelists would like to comment on this? I mean, so sure. Jianwei.
Can I just add in? I would like to echo Kay's views. I would say that Article 6 it's something that Singapore government watches very closely. The key reason is because Singapore being a very small city-state, we are alternative energy disadvantaged. There is no way we can rely on our own renewable energies to offset our electricity consumption in Singapore. And we are doing as much as we can on solar already. So we see 2050 for the 2050 LEDS targets, we actually see international credits as a key plank of our targets. And once the global rules are put in place, actually that will be very helpful for us to plug ourselves into the system. We have also designed our carbon tax regime to be able to be should I say plug and play and adapt to whatever framework that countries can agree to or parties can agree to at UNFCCC if we can indeed get a good deal on Article 6. Thanks.
William, can I have a comment on this?
Yes, please, of course.
Yes, I think for the Article 6, same as Jianwei already mentioned, I think we need to have, I think most of the countries requires and needs a clarity on how then we can implement this Article 6 comprehensively, not only just internally in a country, but also, as Kay mentions, we need to know how then the mechanisms can be shared among the systems and can become a global mechanisms. That's the thing that we would like to wait and that we like to see, and of course I believe there is a need as well for most of the countries to share the knowledge, share information, and even experience on what each country has already experienced with their own implementations in a carbon pricing mechanism or even in the Article 6 mechanisms. I think that's my comments. Thank you, William.
No, I could not agree anymore. I think that given the speed in which we know we're going to have to act now over the next 30 years, I think this element of sharing, learning, understanding what works across different jurisdictions, and then scaling this up as quickly as we can in other areas is really the only way in which we can achieve the goals that are enshrined in the Paris Agreement as a global community. And so that's why I'm incredibly grateful to all of you for joining us on this panel and sharing your experiences with the implementation of domestic carbon pricing. It's fascinating to see the sort of how this instrument can be adapted to the different specific local contexts, and learning as to what you know, what's working, what reforms are taking place, and what could be the lessons for other jurisdictions that are considering carbon pricing as a key part of their mitigation strategy. So we're at the end of the time for the session, and so I hope everybody that's following along could also join me in saying a huge thank you to the panelists. And now I would like us to move on to the final session for today, which will be a sort of some closing remarks from James Grabbett. So do we have James coming up?
I'm here.
Hi, James. Many thanks for rounding us out here.
Oh, no problem.
James has worked for the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat for more than 20 years. He heads the mitigation division of the UNFCCC, leading the work from the market-based approaches to climate change mitigation. He's also currently leads the Secretariat's communication and engagement division, and I guess in that capacity, it's an absolute pleasure to have you to provide some closing perspectives on this really important issue from the perspective of the UNFCCC.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure to listen into the conversations today. I was asked to provide some closing remarks, so I will. It's kind of comes out, it would probably come across as a summary of many of the things that were already said today, so I hope that's helpful. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to join you virtually for this event aimed at mitigation strategies and carbon pricing in Asia Pacific. I'm James Graber, as has just been said. I want to express my gratitude to the organizers of the event, the IEA, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, as well as the ICAP. From the productive meeting today, I think I'll raise 5 important takeaways that came across to me to the interventions from the distinguished speakers. First of all, there's a strong and growing political will for pricing carbon and cutting carbon emissions. Secondly, all countries are firmly engaging towards low carbon pathways, each facing its own challenge, of course. At the same time, countries are faced with multiple crises dealing in parallel, health and economic impacts of COVID. In addition, finally, it seems to be there's an engaging in carbon pricing and decarbonization that all countries have to deal with unique domestic circumstances that came across very clearly. And then the countries seem very keen on engaging in discussions in the regional context and to share those experiences and solutions, and this come across as a very key element to successfully moving forward. If you allow me to highlight these points also similar to what we hear at a global level. In 2020 has been dominated by a global pandemic, as we all know and heard. It's reshaped societies across the world through its direct impact and through our response. The full 21st century will be defined by climate change and our response to it, I think. The Paris Agreement has marked the launch of the broadest ever human coalition towards a common goal, and failure to deliver on this agreement will have existential implications for humanity. By mid-century, which is only 30 years away, which is even less than one working lifetime, the global economy will need to be largely decarbonized. This is what countries have, in essence, agreed in the Paris Agreement, and it's what science tells us we need to achieve if we want to preserve a livable climate and limit climate change-related damages. The Asia-Pacific area remains critical, as we've heard, to solving the climate challenge. It's home to more than half the world population and accounts for today as well. Extremely encouraged by the recent announcements from China, Japan, South Korea, and others. Setting deadlines for becoming carbon neutral, setting such goals is crucial. It's clear a vision we're seeing of the direction to policymakers, investors, but also to innovators. But what is equally crucial is having concrete plans to turn the mitigation ambition into real action. We need to implement effective policies for curbing emissions, and this is where carbon pricing can play a key important role. Every ton of greenhouse gas released to the atmosphere has a cost on society, and every ton of gas removed from the atmosphere and sequestered has a benefit to society, and therefore a value. In light of this, we know many economists clearly see a price on carbon as the most effective way to pursue these goals. But it's not only economists. There are many others who are calling for a price on carbon. But it is not only the thought leaders and the political leaders who are calling for this, who are advocating carbon pricing. We have the Climate Action 100 Plus, a group of 450 global investors representing roughly half of the world assets under management. They're calling as part of its declaration for an economically meaningful carbon pricing that helps to redirect investment. I think these issues were also raised today in terms of the importance of doing that. In terms of countries, there's also their states and provinces. We're observing a net progression around carbon pricing. In total, there are around 100 countries engaged at different levels. The Asia-Pacific area is no exception, and there are many countries which have already implemented carbon pricing or are on the verge of doing so. And to name a few, which we clearly have heard from several of them today, we have South Korea. It's an emissions trading system since 2015. China mandatory national ETS is about to start. Singapore's carbon tax. Indonesia is progressing fast with its plans for domestic ETS. Vietnam just passed legislation with provisions for a domestic ETS. Thailand has a voluntary emissions trading system, but is in parallel considering a carbon tax. And last but not least, Pakistan, with the help of the Siaka workstream, which we're running out of UNFCCC, is working towards a domestic carbon market, while India is also considering a carbon market. So quite a bit happening. Let's, however, keep in mind that having 100 countries engaged in carbon pricing at various levels does not mean that all of their emissions will be managed under a carbon pricing scheme. In fact, some sectors or measures are better incentivized through other means, including regulation, direct public investment. The trend, however, is very clear. Countries in the world are increasingly taking steps towards pricing carbon as part of their strategies for addressing present and future greenhouse gas emissions. Over the last 4 years, we have seen a dramatic change, not only in the interest, but also the attitudes towards carbon pricing. This includes also a better understanding that is also an opportunity to capture the benefits associated with transitioning to a low carbon society, cutting pollution, increasing energy dependence, creating jobs, etc. Let me here point out that this is particularly relevant as countries are grappling with the economic impact of COVID-19 and of economic aftermath. An important question you may, of course, have is how carbon pricing relates to the Paris Agreement, though. And I know we touched upon that a bit today. As you know, the countries, the Paris Agreement, have to submit their NDCs, and it's representing a pledge towards addressing climate change. It's a key element in countries, in that countries are sovereign, not only in setting their NDC, but also in how to implement it. Obviously, countries will need instruments, policies, actions to turn their pledges into concrete results. There are many possible instruments and policies which can be used in countries. Carbon pricing is one of these instruments available in the toolbox. It is a very important one, but it's not the only one. And let me reiterate that the instruments are also not mutually exclusive. In fact, many parties to the Paris Agreement intend to rely on several instruments. I think I got cut off there for a second, excuse me. I hope you can hear me.
We can hear you, James. Just
Thank you. Sorry about that. And I was saying, in fact, many parties to the Paris Agreement intend to rely on several instruments for implementing their contribution. An important point that countries in the Asia Pacific are very diverse in terms of domestic circumstances, and I know this came across as well today. For some countries, it may be mostly for cutting emissions on their own. For others, it may be designed with a strong emphasis on attracting international support. In any case, countries may need to customize their carbon pricing approach to best match their domestic circumstances. We are fortunate that over 20 years of experience in the design and operation of carbon pricing schemes are available. We are also fortunate to have seen an increased policy creativity to best fit domestic circumstances. So having spoken about the domestic achievement of NDCs under the Paris Agreement, I would also give a few words about Article 6 and something you just shortly were talking about, which deals with the cooperative approaches. What Article 6 does in a nutshell is to lay the foundation for parties under the Paris Agreement to achieve their target together through cooperation. The basis for this is simply that 1 ton of CO2 in one country has the same value to the atmosphere as it does in another country, either in the form of credits or ton of CO2 avoided or in the form of emission allowances as part of a constraint on CO2 emissions, for example. But let me nevertheless emphasize that parties to the Paris Agreement have not yet agreed on a rulebook for the implementation of Article 6. Supporting parties to come to agreement on that matter at the next COP is one of the highest priority of the UNFCCC and of the COP presidency. Well, I can nevertheless share with you that many experts have expressed that on Article 6 even today, that it can enable countries to create the larger, more robust, more liquid, and more cost-effective emission markets to enable even stronger climate action. Last but not least, using aligned or joint markets will transform climate politics from an area of confrontation, hopefully to an area of true collaboration. In this context, it's also very encouraging to see that parties in the region have signed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is set to give birth to the biggest trade bloc in history. What is remarkable in this trade bloc is that already 4 countries representing 70% of its population have taken climate neutral pledges, and the carbon pricing set to be applied in countries representing 73% of the bloc's GDP. This brings me now to some more political aspects, if you allow, on the carbon pricing. The academics have also looked at potential impact on jobs and growth in carbon pricing, and have so far concluded to only extremely limited impact to a positive impact. With regard to the impacts from carbon pricing on potential groups of stakeholders and how to address them, we now have a multitude of approaches which have not only been suggested, but also tested, and some referred to today. This can be, for example, in the form of rebates or direct payments to compensate all or part of an impact. Free allocations in an ETS are just one example. Rebates are electricity bills to consumers are another example. This can also be done in the form of using revenues for specific purposes which can benefit communities. And let me especially emphasize that questions about the use of revenues and compensation in carbon pricing are not a mere detail, but are absolutely key. The major challenge of carbon pricing is not only the cutting of emissions, but also doing so in a manner which ensures the achievement of sustainable development goals for all of society at the same time. Very challenging, of course. For this reason, special attention needs to be paid on the situation of the most vulnerable. Special attention also needs to be paid on the just transition for those affected by the shift away from fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emitting infrastructure. For example, workers in all branches of fossil fuel industries, but also their broader community. These last points are of particular importance. Carbon pricing are not yet sufficient to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. How can more ambition be achieved in the future while ensuring acceptance by all stakeholders? Something you were addressing just recently here in the event today. One key point to consider is that goal of carbon pricing is to set an effective price signal rather than imposing a net cost. It is about redirecting the economy towards a low carbon pathway. So going forward with more ambition and ambitious carbon pricing in the future will require more and more schemes to protect or compensate those impacted in the medium term. To find acceptance, changes will not only need to be gradual, but also transparent with adequate consultations to take into account all concerns and be well communicated. Putting a price on carbon is the right thing to do, but it also needs to be done right. And stakeholders need to understand that this is the right approach with their concerns and needs taken into account. Finally, let me also tell you that in the broader consensus on carbon pricing, we have seen over the years an increased convergence between ministries of environment, ministries of finance and economy. What is more, we have also an increased convergence in their views with those demanding action on the ground, those able to deliver them, and actors from the financial world who are able to fund all of this. To conclude, let me highlight and reiterate the message that we need to shift to a zero emissions world. But for as long as we have not stopped emitting emissions, we will need economic instruments to efficiently manage these remaining emissions. For this reason, carbon pricing is therefore here to stay and grow, playing its important part in driving economies towards a low carbon future and protecting our atmosphere. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, James. That was a super roundup and concise summary. And we're about to run out of time, so I'd just like to take this opportunity for the IEA to thank all participants for joining us today. to the panelists for the excellent discussion that we've had and all the questions that came through. And of course, to my partners in partner organizations in this workshop. We're very happy with today's event. Thank you so much. And we will be doing this again and being in touch with you all to help you along your carbon pricing way as we move on. Thank you very much, all of you. Goodbye.